Pirate First presents the 1% doctrine as an architectural and social response to collapse of the cognitive pyramid. The 1%, a post-scarcity transition doctrine.
We are crossing the threshold of a civilizational inversion where intelligence has ceased to be a scarce resource, dissolving the hierarchy that has organized our species for millennia. The central argument posits that the information asymmetry, which once made obedience rational, has vanished. As the capacity for synthesis becomes universal and inexpensive, traditional institutions become hollow shells that can no longer claim authority through titles or credentials. This transformation brings more than mere technological unemployment. It signals the structural extinction of the professional role. The current wave of automation targets the cognitive middle class, analysts and managers, whose primary function was to mediate decisions. As the industrial social contract breaks, we face an existential vacuum, given that employment provided not just income, but identity, purpose, and status. Consequently, solutions like universal basic income are insufficient. Humanity requires an infrastructure of meaning to replace the morality of work with one of collective participation. The 1% doctrine proposes a hack of the urban code, transforming the legal obligation to allocate 1% of luxury real estate budgets to public art into a motor for financing this transition. Instead of sterile, decorative sculptures, this capital should subsidize transition campuses, physical ports designed to reclaim human agency. These spaces are not private amenities, but operational organisms where change is metabolized and meaning is constructed through systems like the Dreamcatcher, a governance tool that utilizes artificial intelligence to filter noise and validate collective visions. Pirate First cites the rejection of an artistic project in favor of parking lots as a symptom of institutions that prefer preserving obsolete functions over yielding space to human significance. Ultimately, the proposal suggests that luxury must act as the igniter for a new social contract. By subordinating surplus capital to civilizational dignity, it is possible to turn the very engines accelerating displacement into the ones that finance a post-scarcity reality, transforming the architecture of production into an architecture of becoming.
Welcome to the debate. When we think about civilizational collapse, we usually picture this sudden, catastrophic event, like we expect to see the physical rubble.
Right. The roof caving in, walls coming down, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But what if the collapse isn't the roof falling? What if the building still looks, entirely normal from the outside, but the foundation beneath it has simply vanished?
Which is honestly the exact sensation millions of professionals are feeling right now. I mean, the ground is just evaporated.
It really has. And for 10,000 years, human society has been organized around a cognitive hierarchy, this fundamental asymmetry between the few who had the capacity and information to plan and the many who merely executed those plans.
Yeah.
But artificial intelligence hasn't just disrupted this hierarchy, it has completely dissolved that asymmetry. We are facing what MXTM's manifesto, the 1% doctrine, calls role extinction.
Role extinction, yeah. It's a heavy term.
It is. So the central question we are exploring today is, as we are forced to transition from a society organized around employment to one organized around meaning, what is the architecture of that transition? And maybe more importantly, who is going to fund it?
Right.
I'll be arguing that redirecting legally mandated luxury real estate capital is, really the only vehicle fast enough to prototype this civilizational shift. While my co-host here will argue that relying on luxury developers structurally dooms the civic infrastructure to become just an exclusive, alienated amenity.
Yeah, and to be clear, the manifesto's diagnosis of our current crisis is flawless, in my opinion. But the doctrine proposes a highly radical solution, which is hacking the existing municipal 1% for art rule. Right now, developers building these massive mega projects, they have to spend 1% of their budget on public art. Usually that means like a massive, abstract bronze sculpture sitting passively in a lobby.
Just gathering dust, yeah.
Exactly. But the doctrine argues we should take that exact same pool of capital and legally force it to fund permanent transition campuses for displaced workers.
And I am fully in favor of this premise. I know if you're listening to this right now, the idea of a billionaire building you a meaning campus to replace your lost career sounds like dystopian sci-fi.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds completely absurd.
Look at the sheer physics of our reality here. The professional class, the managers, the analysts, the translators of complexity, they are gone.
Yeah.
I mean, a junior analyst with a frontier AI model can now outperform a senior director. The asymmetry of information that justified the entire corporate pyramid is dead. People aren't just losing paychecks. They are losing the 6 core things employment gave them: structure, identity, social connection, purpose, status, and legitimacy.
And the psychological devastation of that really cannot be overstated. I agree entirely with the text that cognitive equalization has dissolved the epistemic foundation of our institutions.
Right.
And by epistemic foundation, I mean, the monopoly on knowing things, the university, the legal profession, the state bureaucracy. They are all experiencing this terrifying void of legitimacy because, frankly, a kid with a laptop now possesses the same cognitive power as a whole government agency.
Exactly. So if we agree on the diagnosis, we have to look at the speed of the cure. The state is structurally incapable of building the infrastructure needed to absorb this existential displacement.
You think it's just too slow?
Way too slow. Legislation takes decades. I mean, city planning takes years just to approve a bike lane.
Sure.
Meanwhile, AI iteration takes months. That's why the 1% doctrine is a stroke of structural genius. It takes the 1% for art rule, which is legally classified as a non-economic zone, and it weaponizes it.
Okay, but
Wait, just think about it. It's the one fraction of a multi-billion-dollar budget that doesn't have to justify itself through market yield. We can use the massive surplus of luxury development as an immediate, practical engine to build functional spaces where humans can negotiate post-employment meaning. Think of medieval cathedrals.
Cathedrals?
Yeah, they were built where the wealth was highly concentrated, but they eventually served the masses. We have to start where the capital actually exists today.
I hear that, but the medieval cathedral was built on a shared theology. Your post-scarcity campus is built on a massive contradiction.
How so?
Well, the text explicitly admits that the capital funding these luxury developments, like the mega resorts in Tulum, the high-rises in Miami, is generated by the exact same technological forces causing the displacement.
Right, that's the irony of it.
It's more than irony, though. You are taking the displaced taxi driver in Cancun or the redundant data analyst in Chicago and telling them, hey, your salvation is located inside a billion-dollar luxury resort. That creates an unbridgeable social and aesthetic barrier.
I don't think it's unbridgeable.
Are they truly going to feel ownership over a space nestled within the architecture of high-end exclusive hospitality?
They don't need to own the hospitality, though. They own the campus. The legal framework of the 1% rule creates a hard boundary.
But a legal boundary doesn't erase the physical reality of the host organism. The developer's ultimate allegiance is always to their property value.
Well, obviously.
Right. So, if this infrastructure is subordinated to the luxury real estate market, it becomes transition washing. It becomes a differentiating marketing tool, like a way for developers to sell proximity to a social experiment. It's not genuine civilizational infrastructure. It's just a high-end amenity masquerading as a public commons.
Okay, but even if it starts as a marketing tool, we can't ignore the speed of deployment here. If you acknowledge that people are sitting in their homes right now experiencing role extinction, then waiting for the state to catch up is basically equivalent to accepting social collapse.
I'm not saying we wait around doing nothing.
But what's the alternative? A private developer can conceptualize, fund, and break ground on a billion-dollar project in a single planning cycle. Isn't relying on the speed of private capital, even with its cynical imperfections, better than the guaranteed catastrophe of waiting for a slow bureaucracy to design a perfect system?
Speed is completely irrelevant if the vehicle is driving off a cliff.
Oh, come on.
No, seriously. Yes, private capital moves quickly, but we have to scrutinize the structural alignment. You mentioned the 6 things employment provided: purpose, status, identity, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
A transition campus is supposed to replace those by fostering a community of shared meaning.
But how can true independent governance survive when the operational costs are tied to the economics of a resort?
The manifesto covers this.
It claims these campuses will be governed independently of the developer, yes? But the moment the transition campus makes a democratic decision that threatens the resort's brand, that independence will vanish. The developer holds the keys to the physical space.
Actually, under the doctrine's specific legal hack, they don't hold the keys to the campus governance. The developer provides the container, but the community fills it. Let's look at how this actually works mechanically, because the text spends a lot of time on the spatial and functional design of the campus, specifically the Dreamcatcher.
Right, the metabolic center of the campus.
Exactly. It moves us away from the old 1% rule, where art was just a passive monument you walked past in a lobby. The Dreamcatcher is active infrastructure for what the text calls the future validation process.
Which is a very dense term.
It is, so let's make it concrete. Imagine a town hall meeting today. One person gets a microphone for 3 minutes, yells about a zoning issue, and sits down.
Yeah, it's mostly just noise.
Right, it's noise. Now imagine a Dreamcatcher town hall. Instead of people just shouting, an AI instantly maps everyone's proposals on a digital canvas. It finds the common denominators, it highlights the trade-offs, and weaves conflicting desires into a unified blueprint in real time.
Okay, but
Just to finish the thought, it allows AI-amplified citizens to negotiate what actually matters to them now that they don't have to clock in at 9 a.m. It actively filters the noise of universal cognitive participation into actionable collective meaning.
See, but the Dreamcatcher doesn't solve the legitimacy crisis. I'd argue it actively worsens it.
How does giving people a real-time voice worsen it?
Because you are arguing that institutions like the university and the government are failing because they've lost their epistemic authority. The public no longer believes in them.
Yes.
So if people have lost faith in institutions backed by democratic mandates and centuries of tradition, why on earth would they legitimize a brand new algorithmic governance mechanism funded by elite real estate?
Because the legitimacy doesn't come from a historical mandate or credential anymore. In the old system, legitimacy came from a piece of paper that essentially said, I have a degree, I can think, and you cannot. The Dreamcatcher derives its legitimacy from radical transparency and real-time inclusion. It works because it treats the displaced worker as an equal node in the system, not a charity case.
You say transparency, but who codes the filter? Who decides what the AI flags as noise and what it flags as a validated future?
Well, the community interacts with it openly.
even if the campus has a theoretical independence from the developer, it relies on AI models to process this collective intelligence. The equalization of intelligence, this idea that the taxi driver now uses the same AI as McKinsey, is a beautiful vision. But the infrastructure of that AI is still owned by a highly concentrated tech elite.
I mean, we all use the same tech infrastructure now.
Exactly. And we are just replacing the old cognitive hierarchy of human managers with a new, much less transparent hierarchy of algorithmic filtering. If a redundant worker is told, hey, your life's meaning will now be negotiated by a black box AI in the shadow of a billionaire's real estate project, they aren't going to see a metabolic center for future validation. They are going to see a gilded cage.
But that assumes the AI operates in a vacuum, which the text explicitly counters. The Dreamcatcher isn't just software, it's a physical, spatial process. People are physically present in the making spaces and the encounter spaces of the campus.
Physical presence doesn't negate the algorithm.
But the validation is profoundly human and physical. The AI is a tool for synthesis, but the friction of face-to-face debate is what anchors it. And we have to build these physical spaces now. Let's look at the source material's foundational resistance case, which is the Berkeley precedent.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up.
This story perfectly captures why we really must use private capital.
The Berkeley precedent is fascinating, yes, but it proves the exact opposite of what you want it to. It perfectly illustrates the problem of permanence and land ownership.
Let's lay it out for the listeners.
Right. So for those who haven't read the manifesto, it details how an artist proposed a massive, permanent, territorial arts installation in the city of Berkeley. It was meant to endure, to be a permanent fixture for human meaning, and the city rejected it.
And why did they reject it?
Because the progressive public city council only wanted to commit the land for 5 years. They wanted to preserve the option to pave it over and turn it back into a parking lot.
Exactly.
The text uses this to critique public planning, arguing that cities prioritize the idle machine, the parked car, over human meaning. But if a publicly accountable entity, like Berkeley, is that hostile to surrendering permanent sovereign control of its land, private capital will be infinitely worse.
Wait, no, that doesn't follow.
A luxury developer might build your dream catcher today to get their zoning approval, but the second the market shifts in 10 years, they will bulldoze that campus for condominiums. Private property is the ultimate enemy of permanence.
I disagree completely. The Berkeley rejection is precisely the proof that the luxury hack is structurally necessary.
Really?
Yes. Berkeley proved that the scarcity-era public planning system will always reject permanence to preserve old, obsolete options. The city couldn't let go of the parking lot because public bureaucracy is inherently backward-looking. A private developer, on the other hand, has the sovereign power to bake permanence into their master plan from day one.
Assuming they want to.
They want to get the 99% of their project approved. The 1% is the ransom they happily pay. When they file their billion-dollar master plan, they can legally deed that 1% footprint as a permanent transition campus in perpetuity, without having to ask a municipal board for a variance 5 years down the line.
So you're saying they just bypass the public system?
Entirely. If we want permanent infrastructure for a post-scarcity world, we have to slip it past the scarcity-era bureaucracy. It's a Trojan horse.
Right, but a Trojan horse goes both ways. You think you're sneaking civic infrastructure into a luxury development. The developer thinks they are sneaking an exclusive cultural amenity past the zoning board.
I mean, both can be true.
Let's look really closely at the physical deployment of these campuses. The text explicitly states they won't be built where the displacement is most acute. They won't be in the Rust Belt or the deindustrialized zones. They will be built on the edges in global hubs for the highly mobile elite.
Because that's where the capital flows fastest.
Right, and the argument is that once the model is proven, it will migrate to where it's truly needed. But historically, models built for the elite do not trickle down in their pure form. They trickle down as diluted, underfunded simulacra.
Well, we don't know that for sure in this context.
It's like seeing a fully stocked, state-of-the-art workshop in a billionaire's compound, and by the time the concept reaches the public sector, it's just a plastic toy version of a toolkit. The danger of the Berkeley precedent isn't just about parking lots. Berkeley is the quintessential city of the cognitive elite. It's built around a premier university.
Yeah.
If a city that wealthy and educated couldn't see the value of a post-scarcity campus, it's because the current system fundamentally protects itself. You are asking the very engine that generates massive inequality to fund its own obsolescence. It simply won't do it.
It will do it because it has no choice with that specific 1% of funds. The system generates a massive surplus, and it doesn't know what to do with the 1% it is legally forced to leave on the table.
Okay, but
Let me just finish this thought. You're right that it won't start in the most displaced neighborhoods. But we are talking about prototyping. Think about the Industrial Revolution. The first major factories weren't built in the centers of the old guild-controlled cities, where the regulations were strict.
sure.
They were built on the edges, in places with fast-moving water and thin rules. And from those edges, they completely reorganized human civilization. The 1% doctrine is doing the exact same thing with meaning. By taking that 1% away from a passive statue and turning it into a campus where people actually negotiate what happens after employment ends, we create a working, breathing prototype.
A prototype that is deeply alienating, though.
When the state finally wakes up a decade from now, they won't have to invent the architecture from scratch. They'll just look at what the luxury developers were forced to fund, copy the blueprint, and scale it publicly.
That entirely assumes the prototype survives contact with reality. Let's dive into the actual day-to-day spatial design the text proposes for these campuses. It describes spaces for arrival, encounter, making, governing, and resting.
Yes, a complete metabolic loop.
Right, and it says the arrival space must embrace productive ambiguity, meaning it shouldn't feel like a corporate workplace or a grim social services office or a vacation resort.
But architecture is never truly neutral.
Of course not.
Imagine you are a displaced middle manager. Your entire psychological architecture for the last 20 years was built around economic productivity. You defined yourself by your output.
If you walk into a space of productive ambiguity that is ultimately financed by a billionaire's real estate trust, you aren't going to feel liberated.
You're going to feel profoundly disoriented and perhaps patronized. It's designing a monastery for people who haven't yet agreed on a religion. You can't just drop millions of people into a beautifully landscaped architectural void and expect collective meaning to spontaneously generate out of thin air.
It's not a void, though. It's a highly structured environment designed specifically to catch people when they fall out of the economy. The text is very clear that meaning cannot be a substitute for employment unless there is a physical, metabolic infrastructure to support it.
But does it have to be at a resort?
Right now, if you lose your job to AI, you don't magically transition to a life of rich meaning and philosophy. You transition to your couch.
Fair.
You transition to isolation, to digital addiction, to political radicalization. The campus provides the necessary friction of physical encounter. It provides workshops for making, not so you can be economically productive and sell widgets, but to restore your baseline human agency.
I agree with the need for that.
And yes, it will be incredibly uncomfortable. The middle manager will be disoriented, but that disorientation is guaranteed to happen anyway because their job is permanently gone. The real question is, do they face that disorientation alone, stewing in their living room, or do they face it collectively in a space specifically designed to absorb that shock?
Look, the shock absorption is absolutely necessary. I am not debating the need for the space. What I am challenging is structurally subordinating this vital civic lifeline to the luxury real estate market.
I get that, but
Development is, by definition, the transformation of land for yield. The manifesto tries to wave this away by redefining development as civilizational infrastructure, arguing that developers should measure their return on investment in social cohesion rather than just dollars.
which is a paradigm shift we need.
That is a beautiful sentiment, but it is fundamentally alien to the balance sheet of a real estate trust. The moment a competitor builds a bigger, flashier campus, or the moment the market decides transition campuses are no longer a trendy amenity, the operational funding dries up. You cannot base the structural foundation of a post-scarcity society on the marketing budget of a luxury resort.
It's not a marketing budget. It's a legal mandate. They have to spend the money regardless. They are legally prohibited from spending that 1% on something that generates an economic yield. The money is locked in a non-economic zone.
But they still control it.
The only choice the developer has is whether to spend it on a passive bronze statue that no one looks at or on a transition campus that might actually save lives. Given the scale of the crisis, the millions of people currently facing rural extinction, it is a moral and pragmatic imperative to demand they build the campus. Even if the developer's motives are entirely cynical, the infrastructure still gets built. The physical precedent is still set.
And that is the absolute crux of the gamble, relying on a profound paradox. You are trying to use the engine of extreme, tech-driven inequality to build the infrastructure of radical, post-scarcity equality.
Sometimes you have to use the tools available.
I maintain that this is a highly precarious bridge to the future. It relies on a delicate balance that could so easily collapse into transition washing, where the displaced are kept out of sight and the campus becomes just another exclusive perk for the ultra-rich to feel good about themselves while the rest of society fractures.
Well, I'd summarize my position by returning to the stark reality of our timeline. The cognitive hierarchy is over. The displacement is not some future theoretical problem. It is happening this week.
Yeah, the timeline is brutal.
It is. Relying on luxury capital may seem deeply paradoxical, but it is the most pragmatic and immediate ignition switch available to us. By hacking the 1% rule, we can begin prototyping the transition from employment to meaning today. We can use the surplus of the system to cure the exact displacement it causes, rather than waiting decades for the state to figure it out.
And, we both acknowledge the sheer brilliance of the source material in identifying the end of the cognitive hierarchy. The vision of the transition campus and the dream catcher is a profound architectural answer to role extinction. But the question of whether the architecture of our future will be successfully seated in the plazas of luxury real estate, or if it requires an entirely new, publicly accountable foundation, remains the defining tension.
It brings us right back to where we started. The foundation beneath our feet, the cognitive asymmetry that structured our entire civilization for millennia, is evaporating. The building hasn't fallen yet, but the ground is gone.
The ground is definitely gone.
The 1% doctrine offers us a blueprint to pour a new foundation while we are still standing inside the building. There is so much more to explore in this material regarding how AI fundamentally reshapes human value. We leave it to you, the listener, to decide, can we hack the luxury of the present to build the meaning of the future?
Digital space, filter perfection, keeping pace. Generation, self-obsessed, chasing clicks like all the rest. Boss life, living free. Make bets, pain. Giants rise, code empires fall. Digital profits, claim it all. Typing manifestos in empty rooms, while servers hum ancient tunes. Prior sin, binary choice, static noise or human voice. System crash, reboot the mind. Leaving old code far behind. Break the code, corrupt the flow. Rip the script, watch it go. Dance electric, short circuit mind. Leave the basic builds behind. Authority, exceed, stop responding. Rebooting consciousness, loading new parameters. Error, ego containment, deal not found. Digital rebels, break the flow. Raw electric, watch us grow. Baseline warriors, break the mold. System crashers, brave and bold. Brave and bold. Brave and bold. They think they control the server. Control all, lead them all.
This is a Reader's Digest version of the hard antithesis of the 1% by the same author, from the same source entitled, The 1% Gone Bad. Not corruption by softness, but capture by force. Not transition, secession of the powerful. A post-scarcity secession doctrine. By Pirate First for MXTM's newsletter. Introduction. The exit to the powerful. Artificial intelligence does not only equalize intelligence, it also accelerates escape. The first to understand this are not citizens. They are militaries, autocracies, technates, private sovereigns. The moment intelligence becomes universal, governance becomes unstable. The response of the powerful is not reform. It is withdrawal. The 1% is no longer a bridge. It becomes a compound, not a campus, a perimeter, not a dream catcher, a targeting system, not a transition, a separation. The doctrine mutates. Instead of absorbing displacement, it abandons the displaced. Instead of equalization, it locks advantage. Instead of universal intelligence, it weaponizes augmentation. The elite does not lead society into post-scarcity. It leaves society behind. Military-grade charter cities, autonomous fortified enclaves, AI-governed technate zones, longevity-enhanced ruling strata, robot armies replacing population legitimacy. The 1% becomes the lifeboat of the powerful. Inside, augmented cognition, extended lifespan, automated defense, closed economies, synthetic food, robotic industry. Outside, obsolete labor, unmanaged populations, resource deserts, political fragmentation, cognitive unemployment. This is not dystopia by collapse. It is dystopia by successful exit. The future splits. Not rich versus poor, not nations versus nations, but protected intelligence versus abandoned humanity. Pirate Firsts.